What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and I am going to do a video here where I go into a little more detail on some of the cards that we've seen previewed in the last bit. Now, I have already recorded some YouTube shorts where I give quick thoughts on these previews, but I'm going to take this opportunity to just go into a little more detail than you can get in that kind of less than 1 minute format and talk some more about these cards. So yeah, let's take a look. We're gonna lead off here with, so I'm not gonna show IG88. We know about IG88. He's not very exciting, unfortunately. But we're gonna take a look at Jabba the Hutt Cunning Daimyo, our first card here. So he is a ground unit with 4 cost in cunning and villainy. Has the underworld and hut traits, neither of which do anything right now, but that could change. He is a 2/8, very interesting stat line. So bad stat line when it comes to like stat distribution, but in terms of overall number of stats, he's actually above the curve. So generally at a 4 cost unit, you're looking at 9 points of stats. Like a 4 cost 4/5 is pretty uncurved. So, Java actually has 10 points of stats, 4 cost 2/8, but 2/8 probably not how you would optimally distribute those stats if you had the choice. So, there's that. He does, however, have 2 cool abilities to go along with those stats. So first off, each trick event you play costs 1 less. And then secondly, when played, search the top 8 cards of your deck for a trick event, reveal it, and draw it. Put the other cards on the bottom of your deck in a random order. So this is actually a really good ability. This is likely going to get you a card draw. Now let's take a look here. Let's see. I think, whoops. I gotta remember my syntax here. I thought it was T for trait, but I think that's wrong. TR for traits. Okay. So we're gonna just take a look at the trick events that are available. So there's 4 of them here. So Bamboozle, probably not going to be played very often with Jabba the Hutt simply because it's a heroism card and he is a villainy card. However, if you were in a draft scenario or something and you end up with this Bamboozle in your deck, you can use Jabba's ability to pull it. These other 3, though, are going to be a lot more relevant. So Shoot First, that's a trick. This card sees very widespread play. Waylay, again, pretty widespread play, very strong card. Asteroid Sanctuary, so the thing about Asteroid Sanctuary is that I think generally speaking, there's a similar exhaust card that is not a trick that villainy decks prefer, and that is No Good to Me Dead. So both Asteroid Sanctuary and No Good to Me Dead are 2 cost exhaust cards. No Good to Me Dead exhausts a unit, and that unit can't ready this round, including during the regroup phase. So it essentially exhausts them for 2 turns because that when you use No Good to Me Dead and you exhaust your opponent's leader, for instance, they don't recover at the end of the turn, stay exhausted for the next turn, and that can just be really effective. Asteroid Sanctuary exhausts an enemy unit, and then instead of preventing them from readying that turn, you give a shield token to a friendly unit that costs 3 or less. And that is somewhat valuable, but generally speaking, I think this No Good to Me Dead is a more popular card in that role. So really, the 2 cards that I think are the biggest synergies with Jabba are Shoot First and Waylay, and then potentially you could run Asteroid Sanctuary. I could see someone running it instead of No Good to Me Dead in a deck that has 3 copies of Jabba, so that you get the synergy. Or I could even see someone running both. The question is just whether that's too much exhaust in a deck. And we'll have to see. But these are the tricks that you have available. Additionally, it's of course possible that we will see future trick events as well. It is notable that all the trick events we've seen thus far in Cunning, which is fitting since Jabba himself is a cunning card. So one other thing, each trick event you play costs 1 less. That does mean that Shoot First here actually will cost 0. So you'll be able to play it even if all your resources are exhausted. That's a nice surprise for an opponent, I think. And in general, the discount and tutor ability are quite good. I believe that let's see, he searches the top 8 cards of the deck. Yeah, that's right. So if we go to the hyper geometric calculator here, we can, this sounds more complicated than it is. So we'll say the population size is 49 since it's your deck except Java. This is technically wrong. because you'll have to have resourced some cards and blah blah blah. But number of successes in population, let's say that you're playing three shoot first, three waylay, none of the other ones. That would be six. Sample size is eight. Number of successes in sample one. So if you only have the three shoot first, three waylays, according to this, you have about a 68% chance or so, 68% chance of drawing at least one with Jabba's ability, which is pretty good, though not guaranteed. And if you were playing the three asteroid sanctuaries as well, that goes up to about an 83% chance. So again, pretty good. Not necessarily a guaranteed draw, but more likely than not, you'll get it even with only the six cards. And with nine, it becomes substantially more likely. So that's a nice little feature of Java there. The 2/8 stat line also means that he is potentially a good recipient for upgrades. In general, units that have more defense are better recipients for upgrades than units that have more offense, because the defense means that they will live longer and therefore get more chances to benefit from that upgrade, at least in principle. Um, so yeah, overall I think this guy's a pretty strong card, and I think he's an exciting option for cunning villainy, which honestly is one of the better aspects right now in my opinion. Okay, so that was Jabba the Hutt Cunning Daimyo. We're gonna move on to Protector, one cost upgrade, double vigilance. Attached unit gains Sentinel. Additionally, you do get +1/+1. Okay, so this is a somewhat more straightforward card. Not as many like intricacies to explain as with Jabba. But for a one cost, you're getting a +1/+1 and Sentinel. So compared to similar upgrades, I think this is actually really good. Um, the reason that I say that is, if you think of, let's say, snapshot reflexes, for instance. So snapshot reflexes is +1/+1, one cost. When played, you may attack with attached unit. And then we'll look at Infiltrator skill. Again, one cost upgrade, +1/+1, attached unit gains Saboteur. So Infiltrator's skill, that's a pretty reasonable ability. Snapshot Reflexes, that's a pretty reasonable ability. But I think that if you compare those three, one cost, +1/+1, plus a thing attachments, Sentinel is probably the strongest of any of those abilities. So Protector does look like it's probably the best one. But there's one really awkward thing about Protector also, which is that it is double blue, which means most decks will either not able to play it or would have to play it for three. So the question really becomes, is this going to be worth it to play in a double blue deck? One of the things about double blue is that blue already has a fair amount of Sentinel stuff, whether that be in a heroism version of that deck with cards like Obi-Wan Kenobi, or a villainy version of the deck with things like Lieutenant Childson and the Academy Defense Walker. So because blue already has some Sentinel stuff, the value of this is probably somewhat reduced in a double blue deck than it is in some other aspects, simply because if you are not granting Sentinel, one for +1/+1 is like okay, but not amazing. Now, thinking about some of the other options that we can have for using this, let's take a look here. So if we're looking at blue units, there are some that could be really annoying with. So for instance, if you play this on the oh, Scout Bike Pursuer, so you could play this guy on the first turn, give him that upgrade on the second turn, and bring him up to a 2/5, make him a Sentinel. The opponent has to attack into him. That enables his Grit ability, giving him that bonus power. Seems like it could be really annoying. We could also see stuff like in blue, there's the Consular Security Force, 4 cost 3/7. So if you gave this that upgrade, it would be a 4/8 with Sentinel. That's a lot of HP for your opponent to get through. Could be again really annoying. So there are some good options for things that you could use this Protector upgrade on, even just in blue. And I do think it'll be a solid inclusion in double blue decks. But I do think that there is that bit of redundancy because some of the stronger blue cards already have Sentinel. Okay, one other thing that I want to note is that this is Chirrut on the art, and I personally think Chirrut is likely to be revealed on Friday as the remaining leader from Vigilance, the unpreviewed leader for Vigilance Heroism. Don't really know what he does. That's not I don't know too much about that. I'm not sure what will happen with him rules wise, but I think that with Protector showing him on the art, it kind of reminds me of how before Iden Versio was previewed, we saw Takedown. And if you look at Takedown, that is Iden Versio on the art. I think this is maybe even a move from the game where you do a like melee takedown against enemy troopers. So before we saw Aiden, the leader, we saw take down the card who has Aiden on the art. And before, I think it's very possible that before we see Chirrut as a leader, we're seeing a card that has him on the art as well. Now, I don't know that for sure. I don't have that information, I don't have that information ahead of time or whatever as to what this leader is going to be, but I think he's a pretty reasonable guess based on some of the stuff that we've seen here, some of the other community speculation, and so on. And I'm personally excited for it because if you've seen Rogue One, I think Chirrut is, he's cool. He's also really funny. There's some nice comedic moments with him. I think it's a overall a tight character, and glad to see him join as a leader. If in fact that's the case, could well be somebody else. I think my money is on Chirrut insofar as there's a bet going or whatever, which there isn't. But I think uh, I predict that he'll be the leader reviewed on Friday, and I hope I'm right. Okay, let's move on from Protector and take a look at the Frontline Shuttle. This is a two-cost 1/3 vehicle transport space unit, even though the art seems to be like within an atmosphere or whatever. And action, defeat this unit, attack with a unit, even if it's exhausted. It can't attack bases for this attack. So one thing to note about this is that this action where you defeat it, you can use this on the turn that you play it. So the frontline shuttle is potentially a really annoying thing, I think, for opponents in some situations because it really lets you get around a lot of stuff. So by attacking with a unit, even if it's exhausted, you can. So let's say, we were discussing earlier some of those, No Good to Me Dead, Asteroid Sanctuary, some of those other exhaust effects. Frontline shuttle lets you get right past those. They exhaust your unit and you can sacrifice the shuttle to attack with that unit anyway, even if it's exhausted. And yes, it can't attack the base, and that's a real downside. So I think that like if this allowed you to attack the base, we might see this card in like Leia aggro, for instance, the red green Leia builds that have been pretty popular at times. But because in the current situation, it is not able to do that. I think it's not going to be as much of a tool for aggro decks as much as for decks that want to clash with enemy units more. Um, but it lets you potentially get around exhaust effects. It lets you potentially attack twice with a unit that's already on the board. So you use your first attack, you get exhausted, then you use the frontline shuttle, make another attack with the same unit. That's really useful if you have a powerful unit. It synergizes really well with on attack abilities. On attack is uh, on attack and when this unit resolves an attack, there are a lot of units that have like strong abilities that resolve on that basis, and using Frontline Shuttle will trigger those. Additionally, you can use this as kind of a pseudo ambush. You can play your unit, comes into play exhausted, and then exhaust the Frontline Shuttle to send it in. I think Hera probably wants this. I've discussed before how I think Hera wants to play double green because a lot of the specters have on attack or when this unit resolves an attack ability. In fact, I think they all do. Um, so you can potentially use this to get one of those abilities going the turn that you play. Like let's say you play Zeb, and Zeb, here I'll show you guys Zeb. Zeb has a really good when this unit completes an attack ability. If the defender was defeated, you may deal 4 damage to a ground unit. So he can potentially take out 2 units with 1 attack. It can be really effective, but are you going to get a chance to do that? Well, with this frontline shuttle, you have a better chance of setting that up because you play Zeb with the frontline shuttle in play. They have 1 action to somehow deal with him, or else you can potentially use this swing in with Zeb even though he's exhausted and potentially take out 2 units at once. One thing I'll also note is that in theory you could do this with a unit that isn't exhausted, but there's no upside to doing this really unless you wanted to defeat the frontline shuttle for some reason. So in general, I think that you're really only going to be using this with exhausted units in normal situations. 2 for a 1/3 is not great. It's, there's 2 for 2/3. There are 2 for 2/3 space abilities or 2 for 1/3 with combat text. So like Green Squadron A-Wings, so is 2 for 1/3. Um, 2 for 1/3 with raid 2. So that makes it essentially a 3/3 on the attack, which is really strong, very aggro card. And 2 for 1/3 with nothing that buffs its power, compares unfavorably to the A-Wing or, the restored Arc 170, which is 2 for a 2/3 and has restore 1. But the Frontline Shuttle, at least it has 3 defense, so it won't be defeated in 1 attack by two power space units, of which there are a fair few. Um, could be worse. Could be worse. And it does, you can take out a wing leader or a TIE LN or whatever. 1/3 does win against 2/1, and there are a few 2/1 space units. I think the distant patroller is also a 2/1 space unit, so it's at least okay stat wise. It's not the best, but it's not in some garbage tier. There are a few units that it can engage favorably with, and it will at least often take 2 hits to kill with the type of stats that we're seeing in the space arena. Plus the ability overall, I think this one's very good. But probably not as much in aggro builds just because the way that it can't be used against the base. Okay, so we're gonna move on now and talk about Wolf. So Wolf is a 2 cost 3/2. Wolf Suspicious Veteran is his full title. He is a single aggression aspect icon. He has the Fringe and Clone traits. First unit that we've seen with the clone trait, and these traits don't do anything right now. He has Saboteur. When this unit attacks, ignore Sentinel and defeat the defender's shields. And he has a when played and on attack ability that bases can't be healed for this phase. So Wolf has a really specific sort of thing that he does with this ability, and that is to counter. It's countering mostly blue and green decks. And especially blue, we can see a ton of healing. So if we look at like Krennic, for instance, so Krennic, once you deploy him, he has restore 2 and 7 HP. He often restores, 4 or more damage from a base in the course of a game. Similarly, Iden has this ability. If an enemy unit was defeated this phase, heal 1 damage from your base. And when you deploy her, the ability becomes a passive, and you can resolve this multiple times in a turn and do a bunch of healings. And then we also just see a lot of cards that have restored. So that restored arc that I showed earlier, but also, cards like Consortium Star Viper, which has restore 2 while you have the initiative, or even Luke Skywalker Jet. Oh man, oh, it doesn't show up because it's in the subtitle. Okay, we'll do it like this. Luke Skywalker Jedi Knight, who has Restore 3. And so these units can actually cause a lot of problems. If you're playing aggro and you're against like these sorts of things that have a lot of Restore, you can be in trouble because it's buying your opponent more and more time to stabilize, especially if they get to attack multiple times with a unit like that. So Wolf kind of nips that in the bud by saying, "Hey, you know what? Bases just can't be healed this phase." And he does that both when he's first played and then also when you attack with him, potentially blocking quite a bit of healing that your opponent would be going for. Now, I will say that it says bases and not enemy bases. It does apply to you. If you have healing in your deck, he's going to block that as well. So, probably not the best fit for your own Iden deck, for instance. But I see him as a pretty good option for aggro to counter the healing that some of those decks have to offer. And also 2 cost 3/2 with Saboteur is a totally reasonable stat line. Like, I think right now we see Viper Probe Droid, which is a 2 cost 3/2 when played. Look at an opponent's hand. This card is played in a fair few villainy decks. We see Lothal Insurgent being played in Cunning Sabines. That's a 2 cost 3/2 with an ability. Sometimes this ability is tight, sometimes it doesn't do anything, sometimes it's actually negative. But like 2 cost 3/2 is a totally acceptable aggro stat line. And with Saboteur as well, that's kind of icing on the cake to make him a little bit better. Now, one thing that's a potential flaw for Wolf is that he does not have the heroic trait. That means that he's not going to work with some of the synergy, or he doesn't have the heroic aspect, rather, not trait. He does not have the heroism aspect, which means that he is not going to synergize with, For a Cause I Believe in, which reveals the top 4 cards of your deck and does damage based on each heroic card you reveal. Right now, I feel like some of the heroic aggro decks are very built around this card and really don't want to run very many cards that are not heroic because this is a very important closer and reach card for their builds. So Wolf does not fit with that synergy. He also does not have the Rebel trait. And because he doesn't have the Rebel trait, that does mean that he is not going to work with classic synergy cards like the Fleet Lieutenant. I mean, you can still use the Fleet Lieutenant to attack with him, but you don't get the +2 power. You cannot give him, 2 experience tokens to him with the Wing Leader. You can't use Leia to do the double attack with him. So I think that right now there are some kind of missing synergies for Wolf when it comes to like just slotting really easily into the aggro decks. I think if he were heroic as well as aggression, he would be I think he would be very easily included in all the Sabine build's main deck. I say all of, that might be an exaggeration, but I think he's a very natural choice. I think if he were heroic and rebel, we would see him in Leia red all over the place. As it stands, though, I think he ends up being, because he doesn't have those synergies with some of the other important things in those builds, I think he actually ends up being a sideboard card more than a main deck card. And he ends up being something that you're going to be bringing in specifically when you're dealing with an opponent that has a bunch of healing so that you can use this ability. So I would probably, I'd probably bring him in against blue leaders, yeah, against blue leaders or against builds that are splashing blue or green and have a lot of restore or other repair effects. I think he could be really solid in those options. Another point is that if you are playing a villainy aggression deck, the villainy aggression decks are generally not as reliant on trait synergy, I guess, with the exception of like a Tarkin aggro build. So if you're playing like red Boba or something, I think Wolf is a great card to put in there because that deck is not really built on trait synergy, so it doesn't really matter that he does not have the Imperial trait in that case. Um, just something to consider. Okay, that's Wolf. I personally think this guy's pretty cool. We'll have to see how that goes. Next, we will look at Power of the Dark Side. This is a 3-cost event. An opponent chooses a unit they control, defeat that unit. So this does not, and this is a Vigilance villainy unit, so blue villainy. And it's important to note this does not say non-leader unit. So if someone like ramps up to their leader and then deploys Vader early and that's the only thing they have on the board, you can play this and just kill Vader immediately. And that is a very negative outcome for the opponent. And um, yeah, I don't know. The just directly defeating their leader could be really bad. But it is the opponent gets to choose the unit. So this makes this card a lot less targeted than many removal cards. It does have a great effect in the right scenario, but sometimes, maybe you're playing against Sabine and she has the initiative and her first action is to attack with a small unit, and now that unit's exhausted and she has 2 or 3 other units on the board. So you could play Power of the Dark Side and kill a small exhausted unit that is already attacked, and that is really low value. Um, that's kind of the other side of the scenario where you defeat their Vader immediately as soon as he deploys. Sometimes and especially against kind of weenie decks that have a lot of small units, sometimes this card is not going to get very much value. I do think it's overall a strong card. Arguably in some matchups, maybe you end up siding it out or whatever if like you're playing against Sabine or Leia or whatever, and it's just not really going to be able to get a huge amount of value in normal situations. Maybe you're finding that. I don't know. I have not tested in detail with this, but in the right situation and especially against bigger units, this can hit really hard. Um, I do think that I think it's going to be a strong choice. I think also it may also be strong in draft simply or in limited in general, simply because in limited, um, at least in my experience, it's more likely in limited that you see decks that are like playing more or less on curve, like you play a 2-cost on the first turn, a 3-cost on the second turn, a 4-cost on the third turn, stuff like that. And so in those situations where the opponent is playing larger things rather than a bunch of small units, I think this is again more likely to get good value. So the upside of this card is super high, but the weak side of it is pretty low. So that's kind of That's kind of the story with that. It's interesting to me that, by the way, that this card does not have any sort of force synergy despite being a force power. A lot of other cards have had, you look at cards like Force Throw. So this is so actually, if I just hit in force, so force choke, if you control a force unit, this event costs one less. Force throw, if you control a force unit, you may deal damage to a unit equal to the cost of the discarded card. There's this aspect of, in addition to the basic effect, you get a bonus if you have a force unit, and this is also true. What is it? It binds all things. So again, heals up to 3 damage per unit. If you control a force unit, you may deal that much damage to another unit. So it's a little surprising to me that this doesn't have the same sort of force synergy that we've seen with some of those other cards, but I think it's still a solid card on its own, better against decks that have more expensive stuff, big leaders, stuff like that. And also this rewards trying to keep the board small so that you really want the opponent not to have a choice. So the opponent gets to have a choice of what unit to remove, and a good way to take that choice away from them is by killing all their other stuff so they only have one unit and have to get rid of it. So again, this is going to work a lot better for a control type deck than it is for a more aggressive one, in my opinion. Okay, so that was Power of the Dark Side. Next up, we're going to talk Chopper. Chopper Metal Menace, one cost, 1/3, Cunning and Heroism. While you control another Spectre unit, this unit gains raid 1. On attack, discard a card from the defending player's deck. If it's an event, exhaust a resource that player controls. Okay, very basic, very straightforward in some ways, but the on attack there is really the on attack is really kind of the wild card. So, one cost 1/3 conditional raid 1, that's sort of, that's like, here are these things, and if you can set up this condition, you get a one cost 2/3 on attack instead of just a one cost 1/3. So you're, performing above the curve, because normally you'd have to spend two for a 2/3. But the really interesting part of this card is that on attack ability. Discard a card from the defending player's deck if it's an event, exhaust a resource that player controls. So the dream scenario for with this is like turn one, let's say, you're playing, let's say, you're going first. Turn one, you play Chopper, and they do whatever. Turn two, you attack with Chopper before they can do anything. You discard an event from the top of their deck, and now they get a resource exhausted, and now they can't play the 3 cost unit they were hoping to play. So that's the sort of scenario that this can lend itself to, and that's a really good outcome. The problem that I have with this, though, is that it is not reliable, and 1/3 is not really a very good stat line. So one cost 1/3 on the ground is really not very good. So let's compare actually two Rebel droids. So we have Chopper, and now we're gonna have R2-D2. So R2-D2 is a one cost 1/4. R2's ability isn't as impactful as Chopper's, um, but it's much more consistently going to do something. Like it's consistently going to give you information and maybe filter your deck to be a little better. Maybe you see a small card coming up in the late game and you're like, nope, I'm going to send that to the bottom. Maybe you see, a really big late game card early on in the game and you're like, I'll send that to the bottom. I want to get something that I can play more immediate. So with the better stat line and the more consistent ability, I personally think R2 is a bit above Chopper, and not all decks want to run R2. So where does that leave Chopper? I don't think he's in a great place. If he were a 1/4, I would be much happier with this, even if he did not have this conditional raid 1. If he were 1/4 without the conditional raid 1, I think he would be a better card. 1/3 with the conditional raid 1, there are too many things that just kill this. Like what? So like, what happens if you play Chopper and they play Wolf on the first turn? And now they have a 3/2 that can attack and defeat your 1/3. And even if you play a Spectre unit to give Chopper raid 1, they can still attack and defeat him because raid only applies when you're the one attacking. So I don't know. It doesn't feel great to me. These stats do not feel great to me. I want to say this ability is really good in the right situation, but it's not reliable. Most decks are playing like 10, like 10 to 20 non-unit cards. And it doesn't even say non-unit card. It says if it's an event. So, if there's a deck that has 10 or 15 events out of 50 cards, that's really not a very reliable hit rate. That's like, 20, 30%, whatever it is. It's not reliable enough to get that exhaust an opponent's resource effect very often. Ironically, this guy would be best with Grand Admiral Thrawn, but that's out of aspect, and I think if his stats are dubious for one resource, he's really dubious for three resources. But Thrawn would be synergistic because by looking at the top card of the opponent's deck, you would be able to know whether or not you're going to get that exhaust effect and whether or not you should prioritize attacking with him early in the turn. Um, and maybe we'll see other cards that will allow you to do that and get you that information that will make this ability more reliable. Um, but as it stands, I'm not that thrilled with Chopper because I don't think the stats are great. Yes, there are other one cost 1/3 units with worse abilities. So like uh oh, it's surgical droid, not medical droid. Yeah, so like two 1B surgical droids, a one cost 1/3. On attack, you may feel two damage from another unit. I think the surgical droid is considerably inferior to Chopper. Um, but people aren't really playing that surgical droid, or like rarely and in situations where it has strong synergy. It's like this just like isn't really the bar. The bar is units that are significantly stronger than this. And I think one cost units also have a bit of a weakness in this game because when you play a one cost unit, you're actually not going up against other one cost units a lot of the time. You're often going up against a two cost unit that your opponent played since you start out with two resources. So if you play Chopper and your opponent plays, Wolf, as we mentioned earlier, Viper Probe Droid, which again is that 3/2 stat line that Chopper hates to see. Lothal Insurgent, another 3/2 Wolf, as I mentioned earlier. It just there are a lot of things that Chopper lines up against where he's really in trouble. Battlefield Marine, Sabine Explosives Artist, all of those can defeat him and stay on the board themselves. Now, I do think that there is one situation where Chopper gets a lot better, and that's if you're playing him with Luke Skywalker Faithful Friend as your leader. So Luke Skywalker Faithful Friend, action one resource exhaust, give a shield token to a heroism unit you played this phase. So you can play Chopper with Luke, use that ability to give him a shield token, and then he becomes a lot more survivable, which sort of makes up for the weaker stat line. Maybe next turn you play Ezra, now you have another Spectre unit, Chopper gains raid 1, and then you're off. So I do think that insofar as you are playing a Luke Skywalker Faithful Friend cunning deck, I think Chopper fits very well into that. But in other builds I am a lot more concerned about his ability to get good value, largely because I think his base stats are pretty weak for what you get. And this ability, while it can be really good, is not very consistent. So, I don't even know if you play him in a Hera deck right now because I think even though he's a Spectre and you can play him out of aspect, I'm actually not sure that you want to compared to other things you can do. And maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, I kind of hope I'm wrong in some sense, kind of like just because it would be cool if all the Spectres were good. But as it stands, I'm really kind of skeptical about Chopper. I have not tested him yet. He was only previewed recently. Have not played with him. Yeah, it's very possible that he'll prove to be better than I expected somehow. But at least my initial take is that this is a pretty mediocre card, unfortunately. Okay, so then the last one, this was just previewed today, Rallying Cry, three cost event, double aggression. Each friendly unit gains raid 2 this phase. They get +2 power while attacking. So this is a really good card if you have a lot of units. So it works well in a weenie situation. It lets you do a lot of bonus damage. But you have to ask yourself, how often are you going to have a lot of units? And you really want quite a few. Like, you could pay three and deal 4 damage to the opponent's base, 3 or 4 damage to the opponent's base for a cause I believe in a red heroism deck. If you were to play this, in order to deal, more than 4 damage to the opponent's base, you would have to have 3 units that actually get to attack with this. And it's important to note this effect applies only to units that are already on the field when you play Rallying Cry. So if you play this and then you play, I don't know, let's say you play the Millennium Falcon out of aspect, or you played this out of aspect and you play the Falcon in aspect, whatever. So you play some unit that comes in ready. That unit doesn't benefit from this because it wasn't around when this goes. Let's say that you play this and then you deploy your leader. Your leader does not get the benefit. Same with an ambush unit. So it only buffs the things that are already on the board, and you have to have a pretty wide board to get big value from this. Additionally, the opponent is going to have a lot of options to interact and disrupt you because it you play this and then it's their turn, and maybe now they're going to exhaust your unit or play a sentinel or do some other thing that causes you problems, and as a result of that, this is often going to have less of an effect than it might appear at first glance, and I'm not entirely sure that it's a strong card as a result. Now, in the best situation, it can be really good. I think one scenario where this card really shines is if you've sort of traded lanes, and like, let's say you have a bunch of spaceships and your opponent has a lot on the ground. You play this, all your space stuff is buffed, and the opponent, if they're all in the ground and not in space, doesn't have a lot that they can do about it. So now you're poised to start swinging in there and doing a lot of damage. Um, Another place where this can do well is with the various ready effects. So one of the things that we've seen is a bunch of effects that ready units, as long as their power is below a certain level. So what an easy example is keep fighting. So this is a 2-cost event, keep fighting. It is a tactic, ready a unit with 3 or less power. Now, the thing about Rallying Cry is it doesn't grant extra power, it grants raid, which gives extra power, but only while you're attacking. So if you give a unit raid 2 with this, and its base power is 3, you can still play keep fighting to ready it because it only has 3 power, but when you actually attack with it, because you now have this raid 2, it will do 5 damage. So this card, the fact that it doesn't give direct power does in a way make it more vulnerable because your opponent can attack your units and you don't have that power on the defense. But it also makes it more synergistic with cards like Raid or with, let's take a look, Grand Inquisitor. So he has let's see here. Sorry, it's being a little slow. Um, Grand Inquisitor. Okay, it's not popping up here for some reason, but there we go. Grand Inquisitor has, again, as an action, he can exhaust to deal 2 damage to friendly unit with 3 or less power and ready it. So that works even if you have this raid buff. The raid buff doesn't take you out of range of this ability. Similarly, once you deploy him on attack, you may deal 1 damage to another friendly unit with 3 or less power and ready it. So I think that Rallying Cry has a very high upside, especially if you traded lanes and have a lot of small units. And it works well with those ready effects because the raid buffs your power for the attack, but doesn't buff your power in a way that takes you out of range to have a ready effect played to boost you. However, I do think it requires you to have a wide board, and your opponent has a lot of chances to disrupt it. So it's not a like incredible powerhouse card that applies to every situation. It is going to take a fair amount of setup and having the right scenario. How often are you going to be able to do that, especially in double red? Honestly, I'm not sure. I personally think it's most exciting for like a Grand Inquisitor deck. Like if you had double red Grand Inquisitor and a bunch of this stuff that readies units, that might be the situation where I find this most appealing. But we'll have to see. It could prove to be more broadly applicable than I thought at first glance, but for now at least, I think it is a solid card in the right situation. But how often will that situation come up? I'm not sure. Does do well with those ready effects though. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video, guys. So we went over seven recent cards here in more detail than I did with the YouTube shorts. And I'm actually going to link this video at the end of the shorts so people can check those out if they are interested in going into greater depth on some of the cards that have been previewed. I think as we continue to have sort of the early preview season, I think this is going to be my new format for this, where I'm going to be doing that initial like 1 minute reaction or whatever when the card first comes out. And then once we have a fair few of them out, then I'll do a longer video where I compile a bunch of them and talk about them one by one. Feel free to let me know in the comments below if you have thoughts on any of these cards, thoughts on this format for videos, anything like that. Be happy to read your comments. And yeah, that's gonna do it for this one, guys. Thanks to you all for watching, and we'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.